Hi folks, this lecture accompanies Chapter 4 of your Openstax Edition 2 Introductory Sociology textbook, Society and Social Interaction. When sociologists talk about social structure, they're concerned about the elements or components that make up a particular society. They also want to know if a society goes through particular stages, can we identify those elements? And further, do those stages change the structures of a society? This chapter tries to address those questions through the lenses of several theorists. These theorists have developed ideas or models for the structural elements or components that exist in societies. It's important for us to understand that when we talk about structure, we can be talking about elements that exist at the macro level or at the micro level. For example, we might talk about a structural element of a society being the structure of its government or the influence of religion in a particular society. That's a macro level component. When, however, we talk about a micro-level element, we're talking about interactions that occur at a much more intimate level. Small group interactions influencing each other, and then eventually those influences grow and grow to more and more people, and we change the actual structure of that society with different ways of thinking. So for a sociologist, when we talk about the word structure, we're talking about patterns in a society that endure over time. They become embedded in that society, and we don't really think about them. They are there. We make assumptions that they will always be there and that they don't change. But societies do change over time. They change, however, so slowly that we don't really see those changes day to day. We may not even see those changes in an entire generation. But if you think about things in terms of 100 years ago in the United States or 200 years ago, you can see that certainly some of the components that make up the structure of our society have changed over time. So let's talk about what some of those major structural components might be. One of them is culture. Every society has its own distinct culture. Think about this in terms of the United States versus, say, for example, South Africa, or the United States versus somewhere even closer, Cuba, or Canada, or Mexico. Each of these places has its own distinct culture, and we understand what that culture is. That is one of the things that helps bind our society together. Another element of the structure is groups. Groups defined is people with similar values or norms, and those things again help to support the culture of that society. Now, frequent interaction is necessary to define us as a group. That doesn't mean that every single American has to interact with every other American, but it does mean that we have interactions within our society that are understandable to us. And bear in mind also that there are two kinds of groups. For a sociologist, we have primary groups, which are very important to us, and then we have secondary groups, which serve specific purposes, but probably don't endure over time. A third element is social class. Social class defined is groups with similar power, control, and status. So in the United States, we're familiar with probably a three-class system, the upper, the middle, and the lower or working. Most sociologists in the United States today would say that 5 classes is probably more relevant, with an upper middle, a lower middle, and a working or lower class. There are some sociologists that use a 9-class model, an 11-class model. I believe I also have seen a 13-class model. So, 5 is probably the most common today. 3 is historical, what we used to use, but 5 is manageable. Within our social class, we have status, and status is one of the things that helps to define the social class we belong to. Now, there are 3 types of status that we can have. We can have achieved status, ascribed status, or master status. Briefly, achieved status, things that you earn in your lifetime. I achieved the status of college professor. I achieved the status of college graduate. I achieved the status of parent. I achieved the status of Olympic athlete, and so on. Ascribed statuses are things that you're born with. You generally cannot change these things or don't change these things in your life. However, there are some exceptions to that. Let me put this out there to you. Gender is an ascribed status for most people. Race is an ascribed status, again, for most people. So you're born with these things. They're generally immovable for you, with some exceptions. Master status. These are statuses that help to identify you to other people in society. They are not personal characteristics about you, however. It's kind of how you're painted with a broad brush in that society. So it's people, when they see you, making assumptions about you based on some of those ascribed statuses, most likely. So for example, for me, I am a middle-class white female, and there's little that I can do to change the white and female part of that, and those characteristics or attributes come with some baggage, whether I like it or not, and they influence how other people in society see me and treat me. So master status is a very, very important type of status because it comes with a set of expectations, not only for how society will treat you, but also embedded in that master status are some expectations about your behavior. The fourth and final element, social roles. Social roles defined are expectations about behavior. Now, what's important for you to grasp here is that we aren't talking about you as an individual. We're talking about the roles that you play when you go out into the world. And if you don't think you're playing a role, I'm going to have to say I disagree. Every single social interaction that we have with other people is a role play. Think about that. Think about that in terms of a traditional classroom. You come into the classroom, you sit in a seat where you're expected to sit, you pay attention as the lecture progresses, you take notes. There are certain things you don't do in the classroom. Likewise, when I come into the classroom, there are certain expectations that you have of me, and so I take control of the class. I come in professionally dressed and groomed. I lecture about things in a way that is clear and I hope understandable. And I'm an expert in my field. What if on the very first day of class you played your role but I didn't? What about if I came in my pajamas and my fuzzy bunny slippers and I hadn't combed my hair and I was carrying a bottle of Jack Daniels and I jumped up on my table and I swigged down some Jack Daniels? What would you think? Right, because I'm not playing the role. Think about this. If people didn't play roles all the time when they came into contact with other people, we would not be able to predict behavior. And if we can't predict behavior, the world becomes a very, very dangerous place. So what Erving Goffman, a micro-level theorist, said was, when we don't behave in the proper social role for the proper situation, we will stigmatize people. We will shun them. We will look at them in a particular way, or we will tell them they have to get out of the room. If that happened on the first day and I came into class like that, I guarantee you that somebody in that room would leave the room and go try to find another faculty member or somebody that looked like they could be in charge and explain to them that something has gone horribly wrong and that someone is in the room. They may or may not be Dr. Marshall, we're not sure, but they're dressed in pajamas and they're clearly drunk and they're swigging out of a Jack Daniels bottle. So you play these roles every day. And when you don't behave according to those expectations, then people will stigmatize you. And this further encourages you to behave appropriately. Now, What are these stages of society that we're talking about? Well, it's interesting. These theories are also what we would call models for a society. So these theorists were concerned with identifying particular elements that helped a society to exist or perhaps encouraged a society to change. Really what they want to know is, how does the structure get built and maintained? Are there certain characteristics that we can look to that say this is supporting this particular society, or this is an element that is present that helps this society to work together? This is an element that helps this society to get torn apart. Now, when we talk about the West, we talk about 4 basic stages of Western society. We talk about the hunting-gathering, the agricultural, the industrial, and the post-industrial. And for this particular course, I want us to concentrate really on this industrial, post-industrial area, because I think to you, those are probably going to be the most interesting and the most relevant. That's not to say that hunting-gathering and agricultural societies didn't play a role, but we are today living in a post-industrial / postmodern society. So how did we get here? That's what we want to know. And we're going to talk about the work of 4 theorists. Now, on the macro side of the house, so looking at the big elements that support a structure, we've got Durkheim, Tonnies, and Lenski. And I want you to note here that Tonnies is not in your textbook, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time on him in this lecture. On the micro side of the house, looking at those individual interactions that we have that push back out against the bigger structure to change it, we have our micro-level theorist Irving Goffman. All of these theorists were concerned with what the components are that make up a structure of a society. Now remember, we're always talking about the West in this class. And so there are other elemental components in other types of societies that are not considered quote-unquote Western societies. Okay, first, Émile Durkheim, French sociologist, and he's what we call a functional theorist. We'll learn more about that later. He comes up with 2 different models or stages of society. He comes up with his mechanical solidarity type of society, and he comes up with his organic solidarity type of society. First comes the mechanical, and he sets about thinking about or theorizing what are the elements that hold this type of society together. This is the type of society that he has probably seen most in his lifetime. Simple, basic, common beliefs. These are usually smaller, rural types of societies with a deep sense of community. They have what we call a low division of labor. I'll talk about that more in a minute. They also tend to be highly religious, and because they have this platform of moral governance that is religion, they share similar values, and those types of things are what become the glue that holds the society together. So he sees these as very tight-knit, caring types of communities. And then something happens called the Industrial Revolution, and he sees that as having changed those elements or components of society. So when the Industrial Revolution happens and people start moving into these urban centers, he starts to see different components, and he calls this an organic solidarity society. Much more complex than the mechanical, and now more urban with a more shallow sense of community, and they tend not to be as religious. In other words, they become more secular, more rational. Now, interdependence holds this type of society together, meaning that I need other people. So now let me go back to that division of labor. In a mechanical solidarity society, there is what we call a low division of labor, meaning that most people can accomplish daily living tasks by themselves. They don't need anybody else to do things for them. They live in a small house. They probably get up in the morning and they probably bake their own bread to eat during the day. If a hole pops up in their roof. They get up on the roof and they fix it themselves with some help from their friends, perhaps. But they know how to manage their daily life. They don't have to rely on other people. In an organic solidarity society, we have what we call a high division of labor, meaning that I've got to depend on other people. So when I wake up in the morning, I'm not baking my own bread. I purchased my bread the day before from the bakery, and I relied on the baker to know that job. I could probably make my own bread if I needed to, but I'm not going to, because that's not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is sociology. And so I'm going to go to work and I'm going to teach sociology, and I'm going to get paid to do that, and then I'm going to pay the baker to make the bread because that's what he's an expert at. So interdependence in this type of society that has a high division of labor is required. I have to be able to depend on the baker. I have to be able to depend on the roofer to fix my roof. If I didn't have these relationships with other people, I wouldn't be able to exist very well in this type of society. So I don't care about them necessarily. I just care that they can complete a task for me. Whereas in a mechanical type of society, I deeply care about these people. We share values, and that's what makes us have a sense of community. Durkheim was concerned about these organic solidarity societies because he was a deeply religious man. And he thought as we moved farther away from religion, this would cause problems for us. But here we are, 100 years later, and we haven't experienced the type of turmoil that Durkheim maybe envisioned in his life. All right, so that's our first theorist and his models, mechanical and organic solidarity, with the Industrial Revolution being the mechanism that shifts the structure of that society. And here's why I wanted to mention also Tonnies. Now, Tonnies was doing his work at the same time as Durkheim. Now, what's interesting, Durkheim in France, Tonnies in Germany, and they make nearly the exact same observations about society. Tonnies called his models Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft is translated loosely as the word community, and Gesellschaft is translated loosely as the word society. And so these models that Tonnies came up with were very similar to the same models that Durkheim was coming up with in France at the same time. So not a big difference here. What I want you to get here is that we have two theorists in two different places at nearly the exact same moment in time, worrying about or thinking about these structural elements and how they are being changed with the Industrial Revolution taking place. Very, very interesting. Now, I didn't include Marx at the beginning of our lecture here as one of those theorists who were concerned about the stages of society because he really never set about to craft a model that described society necessarily. Marx was concerned about the economy that the Industrial Revolution was putting in place. Now, not to get too deeply into it now, but Marx was a conflict theorist, meaning that he saw the world in terms of the haves and the have-nots, people who had power, people who had little power. And he saw the world shifting from this pre-industrial type of society to an industrial type of society where the economy would control everything. And so he comes up with an assertion about what he thinks this industrial type of society looks like. So he says that everything in a society depends on its economy. He calls that kind of the base of a society. And once that economy is established, for example, in the West, that's an economy of capitalism, right? A laissez-faire type of government that doesn't intervene in the market, in the United States especially. Once that economy is formed, it in turn will encourage the other structures to develop. So for Marx, everything in that society depends on the shape the society's economy takes. Now again, Marx didn't set out to create models for society, so he's a little bit apart from, for example, Durkheim and Tonnies, and then some of the theorists that we'll talk about next. But I wanted to throw him in here because he has an important thing to say, and this is a very simplistic type of a structure that he encourages us to think about. If all those other structural elements in a society are influenced by the economy, then think about how important that economy must be. We will talk about Marx again when we talk about social theory. All right, now let's move to contemporary time, and let's talk a little bit about Gerhard Lenski. Now, Lenski, a practicing sociologist until just a few years ago, he saw society in terms of 4 stages. So unlike Durkheim and unlike Tonnies, who only saw these 2 stages, Lenski now has another 50 or 60 years on these other sociologists. And so he comes up with an additional 2 stages. Where Durkheim and Tonnies only saw the pre-industrial and the industrial, Lenski adds 2 more. Lenski says, hey, I'm living in the post-industrial, and then he sets about to think about what the postmodern might look like. Now, I want you to think about this because he's alive theorizing about these particular stages in the 1960s. And he comes up with a very elegant, simplistic type of model, the post-industrial, an economic system engaged primarily in processing and controlling information. I want you to think about this in terms of computers, in terms of the structure of our society getting away from manufacturing and moving towards engineering. And so we become a structure that is really caught up in controlling and processing information. When I need to know something, what do? I get on the computer. Somebody else has put information there that I can learn. So when I turn on the TV and it doesn't work right, what do? I call the cable company and hopefully they walk me through fixing it. Information processing and control. So Lenski is alive during this very first new stage, the post-industrial. And then he theorizes about the next stage. He says, there is a stage after that. It's called the postmodern. And he sets about figuring out the characteristics of the postmodern. Technologically sophisticated societies preoccupied with consumer goods and media images. How brilliant are you that you can think about that's what the future in America would look like? And I want you to think about this, preoccupied with consumer goods and media images. Shopping, 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 and then getting on the internet and looking at things. How many of you are guilty of needing to do homework, jumping on the internet, and 2 hours later you've forgotten why you sat down because you've been looking at pictures of fuzzy kittens? You know, kittens is just a metaphor there, but you understand what I'm saying. So Lenski, a brilliant, brilliant man. All right, and let's talk a little bit about Max Weber. Again, not a theorist that necessarily was looking at what the structural elements of a society are, but he was concerned with the effects of industrialization. Now, Max Weber, German sociologist, mid-1800s, he focuses on these issues of class status and power. And he agrees with Karl Marx. He says the economy is extremely important. But he wants to think about things in a more intimate way. He wants to understand the individual and how the individual relates to and perhaps has an impact on the structure. And he comes up with a little equation. He says class, which is your economic place in a society, and status, which for him was based on your level of education, the family that you came from, what religion you practiced, and so on. These 2 things determine your power. And power is what places you in the structure. So even though Weber wasn't necessarily concerned with figuring out a model, he really did figure out that these elements at an individual level could help to determine the amount of power you had and thereby influence the structure of that society. All right, finally now we have our first true micro-level theorist, Erving Goffman, that did talk about the elements or components of a society from a micro perspective. All of the theorists before him, Durkheim, Tonnies, Marx, Lenski, even Weber to a point, had talked about macro-level issues. Goffman is concerned with how the individual creates structure. And his major theory is called dramaturgy or dramaturgy. Either way is fine. And he says that we are all playing roles in the world. And when we play those roles serve to support the structure of a society. So all of these interactions that we have on a day-to-day basis are just like acting on a stage. And we do that, and when we do that, we support the structure that already exists, or we make changes to our behavior over time that change the structure of a society. Let me give you an example. 100 years ago, it was unheard of for women to have jobs outside of the home. For the most part, there were some women who worked, but most women stayed in the home, and that was where they did their work. That was their job. Today, most women work outside the home, and that indeed has had an impact on the structure of our society. So you can see how Goffman said these roles that we play are very, very important, and that they can indeed have an impact on the structure. Now, for Goffman, there were two areas of our life that we had to be concerned with, the front stage and the backstage. The front stage is the place that the audience or others are allowed to see of us. It's the roles that we play. It's everything we do when we come into contact with other people. The backstage, however, is our true feelings and beliefs. It's our authentic self. It's where we get to let our hair down. And the question then becomes, can anybody truly know your authentic self? And Goffman would say the answer to that is probably no, because this is the area where we're doing all of that work to be the person that we want to be in a very authentic way. People can come close. Your spouse, a sister or a brother who you're very close with, perhaps clergy for you or a therapist, but we are changing all the time. We do reflect changes that are going on around us. And so while we may not see those changes every single day, if we're doing that work that will allow us to be authentic with ourselves, then no one else can really truly know who we are because we're changing all the time. So what Goffman says essentially is to be skeptical of what you see in the real world and what you think is real about other people, because we're all always playing roles when we come into contact with others. And so for him, structure, or the reality we live in, is socially constructed by us, and at the same time people around us are constructing their own social reality, and we all have a stake then in how we're behaving with each other. We want to try and avoid embarrassing ourselves. And so we engage in face-saving behaviors to do so. And that might result in a humorous thing. We make fun of ourselves. It might result in anger. We lash out at other people who make fun of us. Or we might retreat from a situation. We avoid a situation which makes us embarrass ourselves or lose face. But Goffman said all of these mechanisms happen at a very intimate level. And for him, all of these things that we do every single day when we interact with others is role-playing. And playing those roles helps us to save ourselves for that backstage region where we do all of that emotional work that is satisfying and fulfilling to us. All right, so let's just quickly recap here. We talked about the four major elements of society: culture, groups, social class, and social roles. We talked about what happens when we don't play those roles: stigma, contribution of Erving Goffman. We talked about the macro-level theorists Durkheim, Tonnies, and Lenski, and the micro-level theorist Irving Goffman, and their models or stages of society. We included also a side discussion about Karl Marx and Max Weber and their theorizing or contributions. And we talked about them from the macro level and the micro level. Now, there is additional information about some new emerging models of society. In other words, what happens after Lenski? Is there anybody out there that might be talking about what the future would look like and what those models may be? And there actually is. I'm going to include another lecture right after this with the work of Peter Fraze. Now, you won't be tested on it, but if this is something that's interesting to you, he comes up with some very, very interesting, thought-provoking work. All right, I hope this helps. Take care. Bye-bye.